Hey everyone, thanks for joining. Today I am speaking with Izabella Tabarovsky. Isabella is a contributing writer at Tablet Mag, and she is Senior Program Associate at Wilson Center. Hi Isabella, thank you for coming on.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
So I started following you recently on Twitter, and I mean I'd seen your stuff come across my timeline. And lately, I mean, okay, I don't want to say just late, but the huge rise in anti-Semitism that's been happening lately, and it's you know there's more coming from the left now than normally you think of, okay, right wing and stuff like that. So if you wouldn't mind giving people just a little bit of your background, and then we can kind of start talking about where you see this rise coming from.
Sure. So it's interesting you say that normally you think anti-Semitism comes from the right. Where I'm from, you never think that it only comes from the right. I grew up in the Soviet Union. Mm-hmm. I lived there for 19 years of my life. I remember it very well. I had enough of an experience there to have experienced anti-Semitism. And I know enough of the history. I'm a historian kind of by training. And the writing that I do is most often connected to the history of Soviet Jewry and also more generally the history of Soviet repressions, political repressions. And anti-Semitism accompanied Soviet history from the beginning and to the very end. It took different forms. And of course, the Soviet Union was guided by far left ideology. And so as a Soviet Jew, I know very well that anti-Semitism can come from the left as well. Again, it takes a different form. And so the form that it's appearing in today in the United States is very much familiar to me and other ex-Soviet Jews and Jews generally from the socialist bloc. So what American Jews call often new anti-Semitism, there's nothing new to me at all in it. The form that we're seeing now dates back to Stalin's time, maybe even before, but in a very pronounced form, in a very, very kind of specific way in which we're seeing it now. It dates back to 1967, I would say. So that's okay. Very briefly.
Okay, thanks. Like about that, because now when I was back in university, so this is going, this for me, this is the late 80s, early 90s. I did a poli-sci degree, and I don't know why. I guess maybe it was because of the fall of communism, so it was kind of in the news a lot. I took a lot of courses on Central and Eastern Europe, and so I mean, I was aware of these kind of things that were going on. But when I said it, you kind of expect it in the right wing, that would be more, I guess, an American thing or a Western centric view of the matter.
Correct.
Because
correct.
I mean, I learned about the Holocaust, but we didn't really learn about what happened in the purges under Stalin. We didn't really learn about the Great Leap Forward. I mean, okay, the Great Leap Forward, I don't want to conflate Maoism with anti-Semitism but we didn't learn about communism. We learned what it was. We learned, okay, this is a communist system. This is what they mean, but we didn't learn about what was going on in those regimes as much as was discussed about Nazism.
Precisely. And that is the question that I ask myself and that I've asked publicly, and it still remains a big puzzle to me about why is it that the history of communism, or forget communism is an ideology. How about the history of the Soviet Union? Why has it not been taught? I mean, the Soviet Union was for decades kind of an existential enemy of the United States, right? Why is it that Americans don't know anything about that history? Again, in comparison, you're absolutely right, to Nazi Germany. Anybody can rattle off, basically, you see it on Twitter, the most frequent historical analogy that people make and jump to, accurately or not, but it's Nazi Germany, right? It's Hitler. Very few people have knowledge to create an analogy or to make an analogy to what happened in the Soviet Union. It's a big question for me. We can hazard guesses here, but the fact is that people are very, very ignorant about it. And this fascinates me the most, is that American Jewry, actually, which for like a quarter of a century, fought very actively for Soviet Jews. There was a whole big movement. I don't know if you're aware of it, but a whole big movement to to free the Soviet Jews. So certainly American Jews of that generation who were marching, were very active in the movement in the 60s, 70s, 80s, they knew that there was a lot of anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union, but somehow they have not passed this on to the next generation.
Again, the right-wing, left-wing thing, because there was an article in, I'm trying to remember if it was an op-ed. I think it was an op-ed in the New York Times in 2018. And it came out a couple of weeks after the Tree of Life shooting. So, I mean, and it was pretty much said outright in there. And I believe they were quoting a police officer. And, 22 or the anti-Semitic attacks for the previous 22 months had come from what you would describe as left wing. And so they weren't really reported on. Like, this is my pet little tinfoil hat theory on this. It's that they spent so long, at least since like 9/11, they spent demeaning the right and saying the right is evil. And, and like, I never identified with the right or whatever, anything like that. And I can point out like things like the Tea Party, all kinds of things that went on. It's become so easy now you have to disassociate yourself with that. So I'll fast forward a little bit to, fast forward to this year. And I think it was another op-ed in the New York Times about how shouldn't highlight these anti-Semitic attacks because it helps the Republicans. And you look at those two things and I'm like, you're worried about the anti-Semitic, if you're worried that the anti-Semitic attacks are going to help the Republicans, maybe you're focusing on the wrong thing here. Like, let's focus on people being attacked, not on what that might help. Like, it's a weird thing. Like and these are people who preach tolerance and love and blah, 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 but they're willing to forego this.
Well, there is a lot, of stuff going on there. One is that the left has said for years, the left has attempted for years, this, by the way, also goes back to the Soviet Union, but the left has said for years that anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism are not the same thing. Now, what is anti-Zionism? Anti-Zionism, they say, is criticism of the state of Israel. It's a funny language trick that they do there because, look, anybody can criticize the state of Israel and it's not anti-Semitic. Jews do it all the time. Israelis do it all the time. It's the national sport in Israel, right? But what the difference is that what the left does, what the far left does, I should say, is that it actually questions the right of the state of Israel to exist. It completely it demonizes the kind of foundational ideology of the state of Israel called Zionism. It turns it into something that it's completely not, and that is something that, by the way, comes straight from the Soviet Union. This kind of demonization that Zionism is racism, Zionism is colonialism, Zionism is Zionists collaborated with the Nazis, that kind of a thing. So they begin to say, well, it's not anti-Semitic to say that. But at some point, it does become anti-Semitic. If you say that the state of Israel has no right to exist, well, you're essentially saying that, 6-7 million Jews have no right. Like, what are you going to do with them, right? Where are you going to put them? Nobody says that the state of, I don't know, France doesn't have a right to exist because France was once a colonial power. Therefore, let's erase it from the face of the earth, right? Let's erase Britain from the face of the earth because it was one of the worst colonies in the colonial powers, right? So it's like you can point to whatever sins of any country, but nobody ever says that it doesn't have a right to exist. So what the Soviet Jews know is that anytime this so-called anti-Zionism rhetoric flourishes, it's basically anti-Semitic. It's anti-Semitic in intention and in consequences. And this is the problem that we have now, is that a lot of this rhetoric from the left comes in the form of anti-Zionism, as they call it, anti-Israelism. And so they believe that they can just go off the deep end with it. And of course, what we saw in May when there was the latest confrontation between Israel and Hamas, is precisely how this anti-Zionist rhetoric and anti-Israel rhetoric translates into anti-Semitic acts. This was something that Soviet Jews know, just like we just know it because we've seen it in action before. And so now the left has a little bit of a problem. That's why you had that op-ed. I think I know what you're referring to, this recent op-ed in the New York Times, which said something about like stop with the anti-Zionist rhetoric because it helps the right. Because now they're in a real bind, because now there are real violent acts of anti-Semitism coming from the left.
Now, like with the anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism thing, like one thing I've noticed is, so, I think it was like 2015 was the last time before what happened in May 2015. I think was the last time you had a real heated exchange between Hamas and Israel, like rockets back and forth. Now
2014, I think.
Now,
before.
You didn't have this level of attack on Jewish people as you did now, like this past May. One thing I'm looking at this, and like you brought up, the colonialism stuff, and obviously now Israel was formed in 1948, so that's well before Edward Said and post-colonialism. But post-colonialism plays a part in that. But I mean that, like, things I saw in like all the BLM protests last year, there was synagogues got attacked, and they're like, oh well, that's property, and property is whiteness. So this equating of Jewish people with whiteness, I mean, it's kind of like, okay, well, what, no one really cares anymore, so we can go after them. So it was kind of like a carte blanche to, for those attacks, because you've demonized whiteness. You've made whiteness something awful and evil. And then you start equating like Jewish people with it. Asians are getting equated with whiteness. I don't know if I'm like kind of stretching, but I get from, in my mind, that's the difference between, like 2014 and now. Is 2014, you didn't have all this rhetoric coming out. You didn't, I mean, it might have been, it was in the academy and it was kind of, hidden or whatever. But like I said, am I stretching, or am I kind of onto something with that?
I think you're completely correct. I think that's exactly it, because we're now in a very different environment where, in fact, all of that, it's very extremist rhetoric, which has existed. It has lived on campuses. It has lived in the academic circles for many years. When people who watch these things have been kind of ringing the alarm on that for a while. But now we're in an environment. What was the article? I'm sure I'm quoting a title of somebody's article. We're all now living on campus. We are. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, that was Andrew Sullivan.
Okay, that's exactly it. This rhetoric is everywhere. It's in our institutions. It's in the editorial offices of newspapers, and yeah, absolutely. This crackpot theories, which are fine in an academic environment, but when you bring them into real life, they create tremendous damage because they don't correspond to reality. I just listened to your talk with Batya Ungar-Sarkon, and I think that she made the same point that rhetoric should just stay in that behind the academic walls and not be allowed into real life. But I think you're absolutely correct. Yes, and not only that, they've managed also, and this is maybe not the not the academic theories, but I think it's the activists, the far left activists, the pro-Palestinian activists, which I say, kind of, I put scare quotes around this because I'm not sure these people are actually pro-Palestinian. I think that they certainly seem to be pro-Hamas, in their rhetoric, because they're very extreme. So they have managed to equate Israel with whiteness as well over the years, which is a completely absurd, ridiculous thing to say, because if you've ever been to Israel, you will see that, you would know that, first of all, 60% of Israelis are from the Middle East. They're Jews from the Middle East. You can't tell them by color from Arabs. There is a certain percentage of Ethiopian Jews. And what you come and you describe this country as white. I mean, there's a lot of, there are outright lies. There's a lot of distortions and manipulations, and there are outright lies.
Because I mean, like, I know a lot of people are making comparisons to Mao's Red Guard. like I said, I'd studied a bit about, like the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet bloc, but this has a lot of similar. I mean, and I wrote a piece about how this is very similar to Islam. I mean, there's a very dogmatic aspect to all this stuff coming out of the academy. And now, I mean, it's everywhere. I mean, the ACLU, for Christ's sakes, if we're going to lose that,
exactly.
if we're going to lose them, like, who else are we? So would you mind, like, comparing or contrasting, like, the two ways of thinking as far as you can?
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe the best way to do it is I can tell you when I first kind of began to make this parallel. And by the way, I have read your Newsweek piece, and I found it fascinating that we both we find these parallels with very different structures and societies, right? But they're both the Islamic society and the Soviet society, but they're very clear parallels with what's happening now. And I think the common thing here is kind of authoritarianism, and I think of it as almost like a totalitarian way of thinking. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but this is what's happening kind of on my end as I think about it. But the first time this comparison came to me in a very clear way was almost exactly a year ago. I think it was in June of last year when, do you remember that famous infamous op-ed that the New York Times published by Tom Cotton, which set off the whole crisis inside the New York Times newsroom. And what happened is that, and then of course Barry Weiss walked into it, and you of course know, I'm sure who Barry is, I'm sure your listeners know as well. But she had a position in the op-ed on the op-ed page. I think she was an editor there. And so she commented on this crisis. And I knew Barry because she actually had used my research in her book, How to Fight Anti-Semitism, and we connected and we met when she was on book tour. So I kind of felt that we think about things in about many things in a similar way. And so I kind of felt an affinity to her. And so one morning I wake up and I see that her name is trending on Twitter. And I'm like, what's going on? And I start reading and I see, we know what happens when social mob goes after someone, right? Really ugly rhetoric, just completely, just dirt being poured over her. And I start reading all of that and I gradually understand what happens. And basically all of it is because she expressed an opinion about what was happening inside the New York Times without naming anyone, simply expressing an opinion. And I'm starting to have this sinking feeling like I've seen this before, because what you had in the Soviet Union, there was a whole kind of tradition of collective demonization and collective denunciation of prominent cultural figures. So whenever a cultural figure fell out of favor with the party, there would be this thing. It usually started with the media. Like there would be, a lot of times it's some kind of a newspaper in a prominent an article in a prominent newspaper. Then this theme continues in other newspapers and it begins to spread, right? This is before social media, but it acts like social media because it's like contagion, except that it's ordered from above. And then this person starts to get discussed at obligatory political education meetings. And so I'm reading all of this and I'm like, wow, this is really, I'm having these crazy parallels. This is just insane. And I wrote something on Twitter referencing that. I think I said something like, okay, comrades, we're going to have a show trial for Barry Weiss. So we're going to put her on a show trial. And that got some attention. And my editors from Tablet called me and said, do you want to expound on that? And so I wrote a piece which was called The American Soviet Mentality. And that really hit something in it really produced a lot of conversation, was read very widely, shared widely, where I compared this collective demonization that I was seeing happen against Barry to probably one of the most famous cases of that kind of demonization in the Soviet Union that was against Boris Pasternak, of course, a very famous writer. It was a case that's still remembered. It's a case, if you go into Wikipedia of the writers who lived at the time, there will be a note whether that person participated in the demonization of Pasternak or not. I mean, it left a huge trauma kind of on the psyche of the Soviet people and the Russian people today. And those who refused to bend to the pressure and to, participate in the demonization, there was massive pressure to do that. You just know that that is also noted in those people's biography. And that is like almost the most important thing about them, because these are moments when it becomes clear who is a person, I don't know, who's a person of integrity, who is a person who is willing to live in truth, and who is not. And so that was in that piece I compared, what I could see there was that we're in a culture of collective demonization where a person could lose their career, their job, their reputation based on a libel, based on a gossip, without investigation, without due process, without any consideration for innocent until proven guilty. Without any of it, you could just destroy a person. And it was happening a lot last summer. I'm sure you remember. Mm-hmm. I mean, so for me, that is where it begins. I could see this sort of wave of groupthink and kind of domination of the collective over the individual. That was a very, very important attribute, a central attribute of the Soviet experience, which a lot of people are not aware of. Even those people who study the Soviet Union, often they don't get to this part. And it's a part that you almost have to experience viscerally in order to truly understand.
The Islam communism thing. I mean, during the Cold War, you had, Libya and Syria were allied with the Soviet Union. I mean, Soviet Union needed oil and they needed allies, and so you had that. But I mean, there has been a tenuous, relationship between Islam and communism. Like South Yemen, like after the Civil War, South Yemen was a communist state. I mean, the revolution in Iran wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for the communist students that helped the mullahs. Like there were communist students that went along with the Iranian Revolution, the Islamic Revolution in Iran. And then the Ayatollahs afterwards then went, backstabbed the communist students that helped them out. There were sections of communist students that were in the protests with in the Iranian Islamic Revolution.
Okay, explain that to me, because I realized I don't actually understand it. Where I thought you were going to was that actually.
I was just talking about the connection between Islam and communism. Like they actually, there has been, like, Islam and communism, they share, okay, like you mentioned, they're both authoritarian. So, and they're both, fundamentalist Islam is a very totalitarian way of looking. I mean, they control you down to which foot you use to walk into the washroom. I mean, if you're really, really pious, you're supposed to walk into the washroom with your left foot. So I mean, it does control down to that level, but it also has that aspect of community. You're all one, you're the ummah, so you're all comrades. So that went along. Like I was just trying to say, like there has been connections between Islam and communism before. Like because they are similar, they can kind of glom onto each other.
It's very interesting for me to hear this because of course, at least Soviet communism was very much anti-religion in general. And when they took over Central Asia, the Central Asian areas, they went pretty far also to eliminate Islam, as far as I know. And so what you're saying now is that even in the years of the Soviet Union, that they could find a way to collaborate. Is that what you're saying? Or
well, okay, they were collaborating with Syria and Libya. They were getting oil because so that's a monetary thing. Okay, that's a monetary thing. But like I said,
right.
when there was South Yemen was a communist nation. Afghanistan flirted with communism before the Soviets came in. Like I said,
that's a very good point. Yeah,
Iran had so that there are. It's not there. Okay, obviously the religious aspects, the anti-religion stuff, they're just going to leave. they're like Muslims aren't going to take that, but the community aspect of it, because even in Islam, I mean, if you really go down to it, like the charity with the zakat and all that, you are supposed to be charitable. You are supposed to give to the community. You are supposed to look after each other. Like, that those are your brothers and sisters in Islam. So like, those are your comrades. And so there was a lot that they could find similar that they could pick and choose off of.
Mm-hmm.
So they could leave aside the thing like, don't have a religion because, whatever, Marxism, Stalinism, the state is the God, basically, right? Like, I mean, so it was very easy to shift. I mean, it's just like lately I've just been saying, like, forget right, left, liberal, conservative, blah, blah, blah. It's authoritarian or it's, libertarian. Those are the two camps that we have to choose between right now. And, it's like there's a lot of similarities. Sorry.
No, yeah, I agree with you. I actually think that the distinctions between the far left and the far right are far less important than a lot of people think. I think what's important is the distinction between the extremes or the extremists and everybody who is in the center. And not just in the center, but everybody, like not entirely in the center, but everybody who would not consider themselves on the extremes. Because I think that the extremists are just really dangerous, whether they're on the left, on the far left, or on the far right. And I think that the hardest thing for us in this moment in America is to recognize this, because in many ways it seems that we're very divided, right? It's very hard for people to kind of extend their hand across the aisle. But I think we have to. I think that people, sort of normal left-wing people and normal right-wing people, who are, I don't know, from liberal to conservative Democrats and from liberal to conservative Republicans, all have much more in common than they have with their own extremes.
Yeah.
And in order to, but the extremes of, sorry, I'm just going to finish. The extremes are very loud and very much empowered. And I think we need to realize that our war is not with each other, but against the extremes.
Yeah. And I mean, like some of this extremist rhetoric, like you're talking about, like, the left and the right, people talk about the horseshoe theory. And since I came back from overseas, I mean, like the people talk about the horseshoe theory. I'm like, there is no more horseshoe. It's a circle. I mean, it's very hard to tell the difference between, like in my mind anyways. I know, like I got into an argument with someone, we went back and forth with a few tweets, and I said, very hard in my mind to differentiate between Ibram Kendi and Richard Spencer. Like their rhetoric is,
Totally. Yeah. No, totally. Look, and like if you take Ilhan Omar, she was praised by David Duke. So why is it that like David Duke, I think it was a couple of years ago in 2019 when she said something anti-Semitic and the Congress wanted to pass a resolution on anti-Semitism, and it failed. They couldn't do it because they feared that, so they said they feared that it would somehow trigger attacks on Ilhan Omar, even though the resolution didn't mention her at all. And in that moment, it was then that David Duke said that Ilhan Omar is now the most important member of Congress. So they speak the same words, and you can actually see it most clearly. For me, this from where I sit, there are probably other examples as well. But when it comes to anti-Semitism, I mean, they're both, they speak in the same words.
Yeah, okay, this is not anti-Semitism, but this was I'm going to get the date probably wrong, but I believe it was 2015 or maybe it's 2016, but it was an article I'd read about how BLM there were 75 campuses where they got segregated dorms of one form or another. And the KKK cheered them on. It's like, okay, at one point or other, when the KKK is cheering you on, you might want to take a step back and think if you're doing the right thing.
No, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. No, I mean, the current racialization of everything, I mean, I just find it, again, I look at it through a Jewish lens. And I honestly, like when I look at the implications of what they're doing, right, without going too deep into the theory, I don't even understand how, after what happened in the 20th century, right, the racial theories that the Nazis had, I mean, we know what that led to. How can we permit that to become so central in our ongoing discourse? I mean, some of it sounds just like kind of the Nazi discourse about race. It's completely crazy.
Yeah. Okay. The discourse around race and all that, like, so, like with this, like I said, you're demonizing white people, but it's not just it's it's those equating those traits to white people. So, like, I mean, I'm sure you've seen them, or if you haven't, like, professionalism, love of the written word,
Right.
punctuality, individualism, objectivity. It's saying that those are white things, and people who take on those traits, and demonizing that, and then again, like, demonizing the people who take on those traits. So it's like this is the inconsistency with this stuff. I mean, all dogmas, they have a lot of, like, logical inconsistencies internally. Like, okay, the idea of race was started by white people. Yes, it was started by Europeans who started classifying everything, and
Right. Right.
now by the 60s we got around to thinking that, okay, this is a wrong way of doing it. Let's get away from that, and we were slowly getting away from that. Then this identitarianism comes back, but they said, okay, we're going to keep the black identity. Like, if you look at so some of the stuff Crenshaw wrote, and you look at the black feminists, and we want to keep the black identity. Fine, you want to keep that identity, you want to reclaim it, power to you. But now, if Jewish people have taken on whiteness, Asians have taken on whiteness, you are taking that same idea and you're putting whiteness on other people. You're classifying them. I mean, you're doing the same. Like I said, it's so hypocritical, and it's they admit that they'll talk about Trump's oh, he's talked about the Wuhan virus and all this, blah blah blah, the Wuhan flu, this and that, and that's demonizing Asians, and that's why you see attacks on Asians. But continuously calling Asians white and saying that whiteness is evil and these people have taken on whiteness. I mean, there was a video on Twitter where and there's a few of them where they walked into stores run by Asians and just say, give me this because you owe it to me because you have whiteness. And it's like, this is insanity. You're driving people to it, and you're doing the same thing that was done to you. You're taking a classification and you're putting on others, and you're putting a target on their backs.
Yeah, no, exactly. It's so damaging. And among other things, what I think it may happen, what may happen is that there will be, God forbid, a reaction from the far right, from the actual white nationalists, from the actual white supremacists, that ultimately, you talk about it more, and you're going to provoke, some very dangerous people. And I mean, it's so damaging. It almost seems to be, I don't know. It's just incredibly damaging. And yes, exactly, hypocritical, and it kind of shows just the inconsistencies, right? Just the poor thinking in whatever theory underlies all of it. Because how is it that all of a sudden people of color who are from Asia, you suddenly call them white? I mean, it just makes zero sense. And the fact that I also particularly object to, and I'm not the only one, I'm sure, is that they somehow feel that they can, and by they, of course, I mean the woke, for lack of a better. I'll start from the beginning. I think one of the things that I find particularly hypocritical is how the woke will say, well, everybody has a right to kind of define and describe their own identity. But when it comes to Asians, when it comes to Jews, somehow they feel that they can define our identity for us. And I just find it just exceptionally hypocritical.
I want to go back to something you'd mentioned earlier, like about the Islam thing. And it just, maybe because I've just been seeing so many comparisons that I kind of, I don't know if you read the book by Nick Cohen. Is it What's Left? Mm-hmm. Okay, so he wrote about, the Iran-Iraq War. He wrote about the Iran, like the Iranian Revolution, but then he also wrote about the fall of communism and how the left in the West, after the fall of communism, so the socialist left in the West, they had nothing else, so they went anti-imperialist. Mm-hmm. And there was a lot of siding with, like you have people like Galloway, in the UK, you had all that, and then Bernie Sanders and Linda Sarsour. I mean, like there's a thing going on there now with the woke, whatever you want to call them. Like I don't know, these labels are kind of silly, but with them, in that that you found with Islam, some allies. Like there's anti-Semitism from the woke side. There's obviously anti-Semitism in Islam. So like it's that, but it's at the same point. Like you have someone like Linda Sarsour, Ilhan Omar, who can take on like this mantle of victimhood, and they're given woke points, and then they're protected now. Like it's like like I don't know if you can comment on like the connection between the two, or if you've seen it, or like things like that.
Well, I think, to be honest with you, and I want to also be clear that I'm not an expert on Islam, and I certainly don't want to. I was just kind of playing off of what you had said in your piece. But what I do see is that the connection there for me is Israel, the anti-Israel sentiment. I think that it always existed on the far left, on the socialist left. This is what I believe today's socialists have inherited from the Soviet Union, whether they know it or not. But I think that it comes from there because the USSR invested a lot of effort into demonizing Israel internationally. They did it for their own reactionary reasons. The Soviets did it for their own, for foreign policy reasons and for domestic reasons, right? Because they wanted to keep dominating the Middle East, and they wanted to kind of keep the Jews down at home. But so they were demonizing Israel, and they were demonizing Zionism. And so I think that in some measure, I mean, the Western left had its own kind of thing going on, no doubt. But I think that to a considerable extent, the Soviets brought that strain of thought very strongly there. And we, of course, see it with the UN resolution, Zionism is racist, which opened the door to all kinds of things. So I think that is the connection that I see. There may be others, but this is the one that really matters to me because both are very, very strongly anti-Israel.
Yeah, the Zionism, like I can see where you're coming. Like, again, I think that is a leftover from the 90s of when the socialist left went to an anti-imperialist stance, because communism had fallen everywhere except for Cuba, and whatever you want to call it in China right now, because it's not quite communism, but but yeah, like it's like something else you'd mentioned, because these are the things I'm really concerned about, like that. Like I get concerned about that close connection with other fundamentalist ideas like Islam. But you talked about, okay, what if the far right, this is going to fuel the far right? Like I'm not concerned about it fueling the far right. What I'm concerned about it is there have been a couple articles that have come out, and there were a couple of things. I think there was one article in the APA, like I don't know if it's the American Psychology Association or Psychiatry Association, but it talked about little kids and how little kids, among Black and Latino, racial identity had grown. And then you were starting to see a rise in consciousness of racial identity among white kids that you didn't have before. And there were a couple articles out about generally that people are wanting to have a white racial identity, Americans. Now, like I said, if someone wants to hold on to that Black identity and reclaim it or whatever, that's fine. But I mean, at the same point, identitarian movements, I don't care if it's by race, if it's by color, if it's by religion, or any kind of identitarian movement leads to violence. Yeah, and if you've got a majority white country with basically one gun per person,
right.
And you're going to stoke racial animosity. Like, okay,
completely.
Now, this is what really gets to me. This is coming from academics, right? So, I mean, like, I think in the last year, universities and experts have lost so much credibility. But this is coming from the academia. Like, how are supposedly rational people who are supposed to think things through think it's a good idea to awaken a white racial identity?
You got me there. I'm just perplexed, and what you said about all of this kind of stoking racial animosity, I again have a parallel to that. The Nazis weren't the only one who were classifying people by race. The Soviets were doing that as well. It wasn't so much about race, but it was along ethnic lines, right? They were obsessively classifying, because they inherited this multi-ethnic empire there were dozens of ethnicities, they call them nationalities, living in the country, over 100, I think. And so they attached various traits to them. They attached kind of security concerns to different ethnic groups. And so it was obsessive. And so they kind of, because for as long as the Soviet Empire existed, right, and was ruled with the iron fist and all that, and total control over everything, all of that was kind of kept more or less quiet. But as soon as the perestroika comes and it starts to fall apart, or not even fall apart yet, but the control begins to loosen, right? And people begin to feel it. You start to have ethnic tensions and real bloodshed breaking out along the edges of the empire. And part of it, and some of it was ancient, some of it was kind of, had a very long history attached to it. But I'm sure that some of it had to do with the fact that they had managed these ethnic groups in Moscow the way they saw fit for themselves, and not the way these groups saw themselves, not the way they saw their territories kind of. And so then the bloodshed begins. So I completely share your concern with you. I think that it's anytime you begin to classify people by ethnicity or by color of their skin, it's just a prelude to something, to disaster, in my view.
Yeah, okay. I mean, I worked in Bosnia and I spoke to a lot of people out there, and it was the same thing. I mean, Milosevic. There's a really good documentary that was done called the Fall of a Nation, and it was like 5 hours, and it was specifically on the fall of Yugoslavia. But how Milosevic stirred up ancient national enmities and brought them back. And one thing I learned when I was in Bosnia was, in that region of the world, there'd been a war every year, like once every 50 years for like the last 1,000 years.
Right.
And it's all because of division by identity. We're the only people that look back at our history. Like the Soviets don't really, or I mean, I guess maybe now Russia they do, but the Soviets weren't looking back at their atrocities and saying, "Oh, we shouldn't do this." The CCP isn't doing that. Saudi Arabia isn't looking back at all their conquest and saying, "Oh, we should think on that."
Cancel ourselves,
yeah.
right?
No, I mean, we are the only, and I think it's good, and I think I'm not saying this stuff shouldn't be talked about. I'm not saying this shouldn't be taught in schools or anything like that, but we shouldn't flagellate ourselves for it, because the fact that we do it is something to be proud of, because we are looking back and saying, "Look, we were wrong. We won't do it again."
Yeah.
And
well, that's exactly right. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead. No.
That's exactly right. The beauty of this society of liberal democracy is that you can't. It's not like we didn't know about slavery until last year, right? Mm-hmm. We've known about it and we have addressed it, and maybe there are ways to address it differently and in a better way. But it doesn't mean that you should cancel America or Canada or cancel the American identity. In fact, I think the power of this country, I don't know Canada very well, but of America, is that you can come in as a new immigrant, as I did, and within your lifetime, I mean, you get citizenship and you become an American, and you're viewed as an American, and all that's really, what's needed from you is your hard work and your dedication and you wanting to be part of the society. And yes, you'll always have your accent, and yes, you'll always have your own culture, and that's okay. That can coexist. But knowing that you have this umbrella identity as an American, it's an incredibly powerful thing. Incredibly powerful thing.
I don't want to keep it much longer. I just have one, like, kind of go on just one last final point. Now, you said you were in the Soviet Union until you were 19, and then you left. Now, again, if you want to, wouldn't mind just talking about some of this. Like, when you left the Soviet Union and you came to the West, were you kind of were you there through like Glasnost and Perestroika? So, I mean, did you start seeing an opening up of information there? Or when you came to the West, when you started reading about things, were you kind of like, oh my God, this actually happened in our country? Like, was there that? And I'm trying to equate this to like, sorry, I'm just going to ramble for a second. I look back at like the quote unquote golden age of Islam and how that ended. And when that ended, you had people like Al-Ghazali saying, we don't need to study anymore. The only philosophy we need to study glorifies Islam. We don't need any more new maths. We don't need any more new science. We just glorify Islam. I mean, that was 1,000-year atrophy of, the search for knowledge. Now, like when you saw the Soviet Union, again, like in the Soviet Union, I mean, censorship was a big thing. So I'm assuming like, it's hard to get information. So you don't even know which questions to ask. So like when you see that kind of stuff coming up here, like, again, does that ring parallels to you? Or like, I see the parallels with Islam and I'm like, you're crippling yourselves. And do you worry about that?
Totally. Look, I describe it in an article I wrote recently for Aereo, where perestroika started in around 2015, so I was 15 then. Sorry, what did I say? Not 2015, 1985. So I was 15 then, and it began to open information channels. I think one of the most important things that they began to do that impacted people is that they began to talk about. They began to publish books that had not been published before. Like they would publish books that had been sitting in a drawer somewhere for 50 years because of censorship. And suddenly, and really truly powerful books by great masters, by great writers like Pasternak, like Vasily Grossman, like Solzhenitsyn. And you read those books and the world, a whole new world opens up to you. And you start to ask yourself, how is it that I lived in this country and I didn't know any of it? Why did they hide this from me, right? Why could I not read these books? Same with music, same with other forms of art. And they began to open a little bit to the West, but still, I mean, coming to the United States, it was just a major culture shock in terms of just realizing that the world, that you really know nothing. You're completely helpless in this world. Even when you are like my parents, they were very accomplished people, educated, professionals. And yet we come into that new world. And because we had lived behind the Iron Curtain, it's like you start like a baby again. And I mean, America just blew me away in so many ways, just conceptually as a country of the rule of law, as a country where the presumption of innocence is a rule, right? Freedom of thought, freedom of conscience, freedom of the press. It's hard to describe just how amazing it is to experience it for the first time if you had never experienced it. And I think I wrote in that piece that it made me realize that actually the Soviet Union never stood a chance against the United States because, here you could discuss any idea that came up and it was a true kind of marketplace of ideas and a contest of ideas in every sphere. So yeah, it was just an incredible experience. So when I look at the trends today, when it's considered completely fine not to publish a book because, I don't know, the staff of a publishing company disagrees with the opinion of the author, I find it shocking because what do they think? What do they think will happen? I mean, eventually, as any kind of authoritarian thinking, this will end too. and then these books will get published and they will get known, and then what? It's just such a narrow-minded thinking. So it concerns me. It concerns me that there are some opinions that cannot be expressed that are completely legitimate opinions, but just because they don't fit the narrative, that they cannot be published, they cannot be discussed, it limits us. It makes us stupid. It makes us incapable to deal with reality, because the thing is, the reality doesn't stop. Like, again, I wrote in that piece, like, for example, the Soviet Union was in Afghanistan for how long? For
10 years.
8 years, 10, maybe 10, maybe a full decade. So just because Soviet newspapers did not inform us about what was going on, didn't stop the reality of Soviet troops being there. It didn't stop the soldiers from getting maimed and hurt and killed, and it didn't stop the trends that war set off from continuing. So for 10 years, we didn't have the information. So 10 years later, it's harder to cope with the information because we didn't know what was happening. So reality doesn't stop. You can stop writing about it, but who's going to be the loser?
Yeah. Okay. The one thing you mentioned on that, just like the last thing, I'll just say this. So the golden age of Islam, you had people, like I said, like Al-Ghazali, but then you had other people like Averroes. After the sack of Baghdad, and when the Mongols receded, all the people like Averroes, there was, all the free thinkers, even though they were religious, but all the free thinkers, their writings, and some of them to this day in some Middle Eastern countries, are still not allowed in. So when you talked about, like, Solzhenitsyn and all that, and you're like, okay, so you've denied the Middle Eastern countries, especially like the North Africans and the Persians, because that's where most of these thinkers came from. You've denied them their own history. And so now when you go into, the Middle East and they talk about Enlightenment values, and again, because some of this comes from the post-colonialism, that's a Western idea. It's like, no, the ideas of Averroes, which, those people took from the Greeks, that came to Europe and that helped seed the Enlightenment. These are not Western ideas. These are human ideas, and they belong to everyone. And it's like, this stuff is doing so much damage when I see it around the world. I see it in India, where women's rights are being trampled on because of, like, the gender theory, and they have always had multiple genders. Look at the hijras. They don't know anything about it. And what's going on in the Middle East, like, it's this, again, another form of colonialism. Sorry, like I said, I told you one last thing and I rambled on some more.
No, listen, I don't mind. I really care about this. Look, one of the things that really blew me away when I came to the US, I came we left at 19. When I was 19, I came at 20, because it took a little bit of time to get to the United States. But basically, I came to the US and I just started college anew. I had 2 years of college back in the USSR. And I said, you know what, I'm not even going to transfer any of those ridiculous credits, Marxism, socialism, and all that, political theory. So I just started from freshman year. And I took a class on Western thought, I think it was called. And we were reading just like a wide variety of philosophers, thinkers, literature that I had never heard about and never had available to me. And it's one of my most kind of powerful experiences, my early experiences in America, where being exposed to these ideas just gave me such an incredible sense of, I don't know, freedom and sense of like your world changes when you're exposed to ideas, right? And I just find that it's so, I don't know, that it's so limiting. It's like when you take these ideas away from people, give these ideas to people, expose them to them, and let them decide what works for them, what they think about them, but broaden their horizons. I mean, it was one of those moments where I realized just how narrow our lives were back in the USSR, which is interesting because, a lot of times you hear about how great the education was in the Soviet Union and people were so educated. And I think in general, to some degree, it's true. Certainly science education was good. But when it comes to humanities, they were so manipulated and so so much was out of reach that you really came out of there with a very narrow view of the world. And yeah, I feel very passionately about it, that that kind of not letting people access ideas. It's just really sad. And obviously, and look, freedom of speech is not such a simple question. Obviously, there isn't absolutism about it, or freedom of I mean, I don't know, we can talk about hate speech and things like that, but we're just talking about mainstream complex ideas that are part of our history.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Look, like I said, I don't want to keep you too long. So if you want to let people know where they can get a hold of you, and I'll put all the links in the description, please go ahead.
Sure. People can follow me on Twitter at Tabaro, and I'm there.
Well, well, thank you very much, Izabella. It was great talking to you.
Same here. Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
And thanks everyone for listening. I'll be back.